This 12 Pro Max is not connecting to a network due to missing modem firmware. Let's see if we can get it back. Now this was sent in as just the motherboard, so it's already been removed from the phone. And if you know how to do this and you need to send in a repair, that'll actually save you a little bit, because whoever is doing the repair for you will not have to go through that process. But we're still going to remove all of this foam, this heat sink material here, foam down here, take off this sticker, and then of course I'm just going to take off the 5G antenna. Some people like to carve out an opening in their heating platform to accommodate that, but I find it pretty easy to remove and replace. So we're just going to go with that. This stuff can be a little tricky to get out, but usually we can get it in one piece, and it's not super critical. Alright, let's get this on the platform. I'll set the temperature to 220°C, and it'll take close to 5 minutes before we can actually separate the layers. I will check intermittently to see when it's safe to remove the top layer without ripping any pads. There should be virtually no force required to do so. I also almost forgot to take the sticker off the side here. We need to get this off, otherwise it's going to make it misleading as far as how much force is required to lift the board. You should also be able to see the current temperature in the caption momentarily once I adjust the camera. Alright, I don't see any missing pads. So hopefully, and also the baseband PMIC did not explode, which is a good sign. But usually when it does, you'll have a lot of heat, and sometimes the phone just won't power on. The first thing I look for is missing pads and then damage to this chip right here. because when these go bad, you can usually tell. I mean, they literally explode. But I didn't expect that to be the issue, because this wasn't a backblast repair. This is just a spontaneous failure, which usually ends up being a bad solder joint. This is a PMX 55, and when these fail, a lot of times they seriously just break into pieces. They'll still be attached to the board, but you'll see that it's shattered. So that looks clean. I'm sure the baseband IC is okay. So what we're going to do is get all of the factory flux off of here while this is still warm, and then we'll set this on the jig, and because that will allow us to attach everything that's required to turn on the baseband, we can determine whether or not it was just a solder joint somewhere along here, probably at the top end, that wasn't making contact. And hopefully that's what it is. And if that's the case, we'll reball it, put it back together, and we should get signal. Now, if that's not what's going on, if we're still missing a baseband, then we'll have more serious problems, and we'll have to do a deeper diagnosis. So I'm just going to clean the flux off of all this and off of the upper board, in addition to removing this thermal material, which just tends to make a mess out of everything. So I like to take this off as soon as possible, clean the surface, and then that way you don't have this just gumming up everything all over the place. Apparently it's not too important to have it, but when it gets in the way, it's a headache. So I'll clean this up and we'll be back. Alright, I've got the phone on the jig here, the two boards joined together, charge port, battery, screen, and I'm going to have to unlock this. It does have somebody's picture on the screen, so I will have to blur that out for a minute, but let's turn this on and see if we have modem firmware. Keep my fingers crossed here. Alright, so we go to settings, general. Whoops, I just somehow opened something else. Okay, about. Come down here, and we have no modem firmware still. So unfortunately, it does not look like we had a bad solder joint, and this is going to be something more serious, possibly the baseband power management IC. I have tested the majority of the capacitors around the baseband IC itself and didn't see anything out of the ordinary. If we looked at the baseband PMIC, I've done the same thing. I've just basically taken my probes and checked for resistance. There is one cap here that has very low value, but it does line up pretty close to what ZXW said. So I'm going to spare you all that because I didn't find anything. And before I go digging into this, because this thing is kind of a headache to remove, you got to get all the underfill out first, and then probably just destroy this chip in the process of removing it. Doesn't really matter, of course, these are inexpensive. But before we put in all that time and energy, one thing that makes sense is that it's possible that maybe we're just not getting a good connection somewhere on these pads, even with our jig set up. So I'm going to go ahead. We know that this is going to need to be reballed in order to put it back together at some point. So at the very least, what I'm going to do is go ahead and remove all of the factory solder from the upper and lower boards and see if something else doesn't show up. Now this process is also a bit tedious, so I won't put you through the entire length of it, but what we're going to do is pretty much just get some flux on this surface. I'll take some solder paste that is of a lower melting temperature. I think this one is actually a 183. Get some of that on my iron and mix it into the existing solder. That makes it a lot easier to wick off. It does take a little more time, but once you get going, it's not too bad. So we will start with that now. This will give us a nice clean surface to make sure that our jig can get a good connection. So by the time I get done with this, it will all be free of anything in the way of solder for the most part. And then we'll know that our jig is able to do its job. And if that doesn't work, I may just reball this and put the layers back together, just on the off chance that maybe my jig isn't working properly, because getting that little stupid PMIC or power management chip for the baseband is kind of a headache, honestly. So I'll be back when this is ready. Well, that didn't help. Everything is well, I probed around here. I can't find anything that seems out of spec, but it's a little difficult to test power rails the way this phone is set up, because you've got to have the two layers connected together somehow, and once you do that, there's no way to get a probe inside here. So I think we are going to replace the baseband PMIC, and if that doesn't fix the issue, I don't know what will. It's worth a shot. Fun thing, of course, is clearing the underfill around this thing. It is very difficult to remove, so we're going to use some heat and a blade here and try not to do too much damage to the surrounding components. That's the fun part. Okay, I think that's about as far as we can go before we risk disconnecting some of these other components, which is what we're trying to avoid, is the glue pulling them out at the same time. So breaking through the glue without actually disrupting the components themselves. Now to get underneath this thing, I think we're going to have to make some room. So one of these is going to go. I'm going to go with this coil. I'm going to take this off for the moment, so that we can get underneath. And let's make sure we got all this glue off. Yeah, need to clear this too. Bad angle for me. Alright, I think that'll do it. See if we can get this off. Whew, nudged that one. Did you see that? Hopefully that bounced right back. Alright, let's set this coil aside somewhere safe. And we should be close enough to temperature. This guy is just about ready to come out. Need to get underneath the side here. Not my favorite tool. There we go. And he's off. And I don't think we lost anything in the meantime, so we'll smooth these out. Yeah, it's going to be tough. We're going to need some low temp here also. Make this easier to wick. Alright. That looks lovely, doesn't it? Alright, I think we got most of that off. Well, let's wipe this down here. And still got stuff in the corners. I'm not sure if I knocked these capacitors out of position or not, because they weren't exactly straight when we started. Mainly concerned about this one. It seems to be attached though. I just got a little bit of this gunk left over to clean up. And looks like we need to smooth those out a little more. Alright, edges are pretty clear. Just got to knock down a couple of these pads that are still uneven. And I think we'll be ready for our new piece. Alright, that ought to do it. I really hope this solves the problem. But I want to make sure I didn't cut through that line somehow, because it doesn't appear as if there's a if I went too deep. Nope, that's connected. That's connected. I'm going to put a tiny bit of solder mask in there just so it looks a little nicer. It's unlikely to cause any harm, but I don't want to have to do this twice, that is for sure. I think what we will do is add a bit of leaded solder here so that this coil goes on easily. And you can see there's actually a little bit of glue left that we do not need, because I think solder is sufficient to hold these components in place. Don't really need to add all this glue. Seems like kind of a waste. It definitely makes my job harder, if nothing else. Right, let's get some solder on here. That's plenty. That's plenty for both sides. anyways, we're going to have this. Oh, by the way, let's check and make sure all the solder balls look good. And we're going to be facing this away. So I'm going to have this ready to go. I'm going to preheat the board, drop some solder on there, and everything should float right into place. Right? That's the plan. I swear, this one cap has me curious here. I swear that thing was crooked when I took this off, but now I can't remember, so I'm just going to spot check here. In fact, okay, so on this side we've got ground. This side we've got 326, that's good. I also want to check right around this little chip because, as you probably noticed, it jumped a little bit earlier. 260 there, 260 there. 340, 300, 282, and 468. No signs of obvious shorts. And we've got our new baseband power management IC installed. And if this doesn't solve the problem, I'm not sure what will, because everything else looks good. Well, somehow I managed to turn my camera off while I was reballing the interposer board, so I'm going to do another one. This is actually a different phone, but I wanted to kind of demonstrate my technique here, and hopefully that'll help someone. Starting off here, this is a mechanic platform that I'm putting this on, and there's a stencil, of course, that fits over the top of this. And let's see, let's make sure these are all clean. I'm going to go ahead and clean this out from the previous use, make sure we don't have any solder stuck on inside of the holes there. Obviously, anything clogging these holes is going to be a problem. So we'll make sure that's not the case, and then I'll show you one thing about this particular one. I'm not sure why, but no matter what I do, it never wants to sit down flat right up in this area here. So I can get this on down at this end. Let's make sure this thing's dry first of all. Alright, so we'll set this down and align it this way. Where are you? Okay, there's a little hole up here, and there's one down in this corner, but you'll still have a little bit of play either way. So you want to make sure that's nice and straight. You can see through everywhere here. Hopefully we got that clean enough. But up here, it never sits down perfectly straight. No matter what I do, if I bend this tab or not, doesn't seem to matter. There's something about this that makes it pop up here. So that shouldn't be an issue. We'll do this section last. Getting the consistency right on your solder paste is very important. If it's too wet, these things are going to run together when you heat it up. It's all going to run together, which isn't good. And if it's too dry, it won't stay on the interposer. It'll actually come out with the stencil. So I want this stuff to be not quite wet enough that you can see moisture, but almost to that point. So a lot of the guys will do is take this out, put it on a paper towel. You can fold the paper towel over, try to soak it up a little bit. I hope this is still wet enough, actually, because sometimes when you take it from the top of the bottle, it isn't. You can see it's a lot more wet down inside here, but I'm going to try this. If it fails, we just do it over. Not a big deal. But if you want to test a small area first, that's not a bad idea. So we'll get some of this on our spreader and just kind of, let's get this focused. There we go. Okay, so we're going to spread it, keep everything in one place here. You see it's still kind of popping up on me, but that's okay. So what I want to do is test and confirm that this stuff is going to stay down and not come up when I lift this little metal piece. So if we just lift it here, you can see we're leaving behind solder paste on these pads. It's not perfectly aligned. It's off by a little bit, but that's not going to be a deal breaker as long as it doesn't flow onto the other adjacent pads. We can still use it. Now getting this thing back on straight is kind of important. I think we'll be okay there. So I'm going to go ahead and go over this and then we'll check it again. But at least we do know that our solder paste is the right consistency. You can spread this on with your finger if you want to. But it seems like this helps remove the excess pretty efficiently. And don't despair if it doesn't work the first time. This definitely took me some practice to get to the point where I was somewhat consistent with it. It's deceptively simple. Now it's always possible you have to touch up a few of these, add a solder ball here and there, or maybe separate some that got fused together, but as long as it's not too many, it's not a huge deal. Now over here you can see this thing's lifting up, which is really annoying, so I'm going to push down on it. Moved it there just a hair, trying to get better aligned. You don't want it jumping up and down the whole time. Pretty sure we've got decent coverage on here. The question is whether or not any of those did run together. So we'll keep pressure on here while we wipe it down. So just very carefully lift up here and kind of peel it while we lift up the other side at the same time. And if you take a look, all this stuff is just off by a hair, but I think we'll be okay. Even if a couple run together like that, it might need to be redone, not necessarily. For the most part, we should be okay. Once we get it on the platform, we'll find out. And we'll keep an eye on this spot. Where was it? Right over here. I have a feeling some of these might run together. If they do, we can fix them, but go ahead and turn on the heat. Get these things to melt. And by the way, I'm setting my platform to 180. We don't need 220 anymore. Hit start, and when the smoke starts coming out, I'll turn on the fume extractor. Alright, so these are starting to melt at the bottom first. follow it up. It's going all the way around. And I think we're good, actually. So I'm going to go ahead and kill the heat and let that sit for a minute and cool down, and then we'll come back and check on it. Yeah, it looks like we got lucky up here in this corner. None of those things stuck together, so that's good news. And if we just go around here, make sure these are fairly even. So if any of these look like they're too big or too small, we can correct that with the tip of the soldering iron or by adding solder ball. But if it's a ground, which most of the ones on the outside are, and they come up short, I'm not worried about it. And here's a good example. A couple things I want to point out also. One, some of these don't have any anything in the stencil that allows you to add solder, so you don't need it here. This is going to be a ground. This one has a little less solder than I like, but it is definitely a ground. You can see it's connected there. And outside of that, I think we got most of them. This one might be a little short here. And these are still molten. So let me get this board off the platform because it's still a little too warm for me to be poking at them. It's kind of a bummer. My first one, the one that I did for the phone, actually came out pretty good. But as you can see here, we have less solder than we want. So let's see if any or all of these go to ground. So if they don't, then that can be a problem. That is not ground. Okay, so this one came up a little short. This one, I wonder what that is, because it almost looks like there wasn't anything cut out for it in the stencil. And that says OL. Alright, let's check the rest. Most of these look good. I don't want to make this video longer than it needs to be. The important thing is, if you come up with some of these fused together, you know, if you've got a couple that are stuck together, you can just stick your iron on them and that will separate them. But what that means is then you've got to make sure that you've got enough solder in that spot. Now you can put the stencil back down again and try and respread it that way, but that's a very time-consuming method. So what I'm going to do is just add a solder ball here, a little bit of flux. That was a lot of flux. And we'll put probably a 0.2 millimeter. I think it's 0.2 millimeter there. And I probably, if this was not ground, I would probably put one there too. Let's see what this looks like. Yeah, so I'd probably add something there. I'm not sure if it'll fit 0.2 or not, but I just want to show you one. I'm just going to do one demo so you can see. So these things are a lot of fun to work with. So I've got the cap from my 0.2 millimeter solder balls. We're just going to grab one of these, and they often stick to your tweezers pretty easily. Make sure you put your cap back on if you don't want solder balls all over the place. And then we're going to set one right here. And then you'll see that little dimple I made might help us. I don't know if it will or not. First, we need to get off of the blue mat because it is going to warp when we hit this with some hot air. Alright, so I'll zoom in as far as I can. And we'll come in here at about 410 or so. Probably could actually go about 400. Let's give that a shot. And my airflow is going to be very low. 30 is about the lowest I'll go. Let's see if that doesn't... Yeah, I think that'll work. I have to go... Oh, there we go. Ah, it finally dropped. Okay. When I moved away, oddly enough, finally went into position. So as you can see, we're able to add anywhere you see something a little short, you can just add one of those. At this point, I'm just going to put a very thin layer of flux around the perimeter. And the key here is not to get too much. You definitely want good coverage, but if you put this stuff on too thick, the problem is it will start to bubble, and that of course will prevent it from sitting down flat. So what I usually do is put a thin layer along here, and then I'll just kind of smooth it out with my tweezers and make sure that we don't have any big globs of solder anywhere. And once we have that looking the way we like it, we will put the top board on, get everything aligned, turn on the heat, and again, I'm going to just set this to 180. I'll speed up the video so you don't have to sit through that whole process. And you'll see that once all of the solder is melted, we can kind of just nudge the board and it'll snap back into place, so we know we got everything lined up properly. And from there, it's just a matter of letting it cool down, reassembling the phone, and making sure it works. Now, as you can see, when I push the upper board here, kind of nudge it a little bit, it will pull itself back into position. We'll check the upper end, make sure it does the same thing, and then we can shut off the heater and let it cool down. Alright, so we've got the board back together, just kind of plugged in our display, charge port, and battery again. We'll use this to make the phone turn on.